Welcome, everyone. It's 3 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to this month's Soil Health Nexus Digital Cafe. My name is Christina Corral from Michigan State University Extension, along with Ann Nardi from University of Wisconsin. We welcome you this month to our Digital Cafe. A little bit about our series and who we are. We are a university-led research team dedicated to increasing access to research-based soil health knowledge and how to teach it in an accurate way. Our team includes everybody from the 12-state North Central region. The format for today will be a presentation that Dr. Rob Myers will be giving us on some cover crops. And then after his talk, we will have a time for question and answers, and then we'll have a breakout rooms. And our breakout rooms are divided up into 5 different areas: researchers, educators, agencies, farmers, and students. And you will self-pick which research room you want or which breakout room you want to go into. So I'm going to go ahead and not spend any more time on introductions and let Rob introduce himself. So with that, Rob, I'm going to stop share. And if you want to go ahead and start the presentation. At any point in time, please put questions in the chat box.
Sounds good. Thanks, Christina. Yes, I'll go ahead and share my slides. And I think we had a little bit older title there. So actually what I'm going to talk about is the top 10 cover crop impacts on soil health. So I know many of you on the call, but for those that don't know me, I work at the University of Missouri, and I have 2 roles I play. One is I direct the Center for Regenerative Agriculture at the University of Missouri. We do work not only in the Midwest, but nationally on a variety of regenerative topics, but cover crops and soil health are the biggest thing we work on, have quite a few projects in that area. And then I also work with the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program, specifically for the North Central region as the Professional Development Program Coordinator, but work in a liaison role nationally on cover crops and soil health with SARE. So pleased to be with you today. It's a very exciting time in the world of cover crops, as you all know. And one of the questions, of course, we often get from farmers is, well, I've been hearing about the cover crops are great for soil health, but what are the details of that? So what I'd like to do today is get into some more specifics that I hope that you can use in your programs. And I want to say that feel free to use these slides. I'm sure they'll be shared with you. They're also available as part of a package of cover crop presentations that we've worked with the Midwest Cover Crop Council on. So if you go on to their website, we have them. They're also on our Center for Regenerative Ag website. So we've created these slide sets for you to use as educators in your own program, whether you grab a single slide or use the whole slide set. The ones that are on the Cover Crop Council website and our center website have instructor notes on each slide that I put together so that you can use these for your own roles. So with that, I will dive right into it. So of course, when we look at cover crops, we see that green, beautiful cover. And I've been noticing driving around Missouri this year that I'm seeing more cover crops than ever before. It's just amazing how the acreage keeps growing. We probably have over 1 million acres now in Missouri, we think. But we don't know necessarily what's happening underneath the ground, right, in the soil. And so that's a big part of what I want to talk about today is the things that we can't see as easily, really what's happening underneath our feet. You've all heard that cover crops are important for feeding the soil food web, but as we're talking to farmers that are not too used to cover crops or kind of new to the topic of soil health, I think this is just a really good point to be stressing with them. And I kind of equate it to, when we were kids ourselves going through grade school, we learned a little bit, we were first being taught about biology. Probably one of the first lessons you had, if you were like me, was something about the food chain in the ocean, right? That there are plankton in the ocean, and those are fed on by shrimp and other creatures, and the shrimp are fed on by small fish, and they're fed on by bigger fish. And it's kind of easy for us to picture, and maybe why it's a common lesson in biology, but what's harder to picture is what's going on in the soil, because a lot of it is microscopic, of course. We're talking about the fungi and bacteria, protozoa, nematodes. Those are things we can't see without a microscope. And we might be able to see some of the insects, certainly the earthworms in the soil. But there's an incredibly complex food web, as you're all well aware. And you probably heard the statement that in a healthy soil, there are as many soil organisms as there are people on the planet Earth. So there could be 8 billion organisms in a tablespoon of healthy soil, which is just mind-boggling to me. And of course, we are gradually learning more and more about these organisms in the soil. I'm sure you've been hearing about how roots exudate carbohydrates or simple sugars that are taken up by some of the microbes in the soil. And in return, there's this relationship where some fungi and bacteria are going to release nutrients back to the plant roots. And so that whole food chain is just an incredibly important thing, I think, to be communicating about with soil health. And of course, the cover crops play the role of providing those living roots during much of the year when we might not otherwise have anything be growing. Now, I took this photo a few years back on a field that was right next to my family farm in central Illinois, where I grew up. And this field had been tilled a couple of times in the fall. And I kind of equate it to, when we think about the microbes there, it's like going to the grocery store in the fall and being told, well, sorry, we're out of food, come back next spring. And when that happens, of course, the microbes are going to die, or some of them are going to go dormant, but certainly they're not going to be thriving when we don't have any living roots in the soil. Some of you probably heard the statement by Jerry Hatfield, who pointed out that feeding all the soil organisms below ground in 1 acre is like feeding 2 African elephants. So if you think about 2 elephants roaming around on a football field and trying to stay alive, they need a lot of food every day, right? And that's what we need with these soil microbes in an acre. We need a lot of food to keep them alive, and the cover crops play an incredibly important role in making that possible. Now, I've heard some farmers talk about that they're motivated to use cover crops because they're recognizing that that's taking advantage of a free resource, namely the solar energy that falls on the ground 7 to 8 months of the year when we don't have cash crops growing, especially with our summer cash crops. And so if we can harvest that through the cover crops to feed the soil biology, then that's going to pay lots of dividends for our system. So that's really the first point, is that soil food chain. The second point I want to get to in terms of impacts on soil health from cover crops is earthworms. I said it's difficult to see all those microbes, but fortunately we can see one indicator of what's happening with cover crops, which is earthworms. You're probably all well aware that cover crops have been shown to boost earthworm activity and presence. There was a study in Iowa looking just at using cereal rye, and they found that it tripled the number of earthworms versus having no cover crop. And you can look at earthworm middens or other approaches to also see increases in earthworm activity. When I visualize in my mind a profile of a soil in a cover crop area versus a tilled area, I think this diagram is kind of helpful. And I grew up in a system where we had cover crops on our farm, but we still did a lot of tillage. And of course, when we're doing that tillage, historically we thought, well, that's good because we're getting a lot of uniformity in that root zone. We've learned that there can be some downsides, like having a plow pan, regardless of whether we're using a disc or plow or other instruments. But what I was not aware of until maybe the last 15 years or so was the impact that tillage and lack of cover crops is having on that soil profile in terms of aggregate structure, and perhaps something we can see in this diagram, the existence of macropores. The macropores are channels created by earthworms and by decaying roots, whether it's a crop root or cover crop root, are incredibly important to getting rain into the soil. We hear more and more all the time about how cover crops help with resiliency. We've just finished a large study looking at 6 states, in the Midwest, when we had really wet weather in 2019. The farmers that were using cover crops were less likely to have collected prevent plant insurance. In other words, they still planted their crop rather than having to give up on it from wet soils. And they also planted earlier. And I think macropores play a big role in that when we have cover crop and reduced disturbance systems. We're getting that water down into the soil, and with better aggregate structure, we've got more place to store that soil moisture. And of course, that helps in dry periods as well, where we've got more moisture in the soil. So the earthworms are something we can see readily. Some people have said they're like soil engineers because they're redistributing nutrients. Along that earthworm channel is a very high zone of fertility, which is a place that the cash crop roots are going to tend to go to because of those nutrients, and just improves overall rooting environment as well. I didn't know until several years ago that there are actually lots of different species of earthworms. Three common categories of earthworms that we might see in the Midwest soils, or night crawlers are probably the ones we're most familiar with. They tend to tunnel vertically. And if you do a little bit of searching on YouTube videos, you can find videos of night crawlers pulling leaves and vegetation down into the soil. It's pretty amazing that they do that. But they're the worms we see out on sidewalks and so on most often after rain. There are also pale gray worms that tend to tunnel more horizontally. And then if we have a lot of leaf litter, like in a no-till system, or more often in a forested soil, we can get red worms or epigeic worms that are also active on those surface layers. But regardless, these earthworms do provide a lot of tunneling and movement of nutrients around in the soil. And of course, are something that are going to be stimulated by the cover crops. So a third area that we see the cover crops impacting soil health is certainly soil organic matter and soil carbon. This is a photo of Dan DeSutter, a farmer I've gotten to know well from Indiana. I've been on his farm a couple times. And Dan is one of these farmers that says for himself, a big goal with his farming operation is to rebuild his soil carbon. He personally has the goal of getting his soil carbon back to the level, or his organic matter back to the level it was when that land first started being farming. Now we know nationally that we've lost about half our organic matter. Of course, it varies from field to field and soil type to soil type. But this is from Ray Weil's textbook, The Nature and Property of Soils, which is the main undergraduate soils text. And Ray created this diagram to show how over time, and it didn't happen just in a year, it took decades, but we've lost about half of that organic matter. The good news, if you look past the dashed line to the right, you can see the potential to rebuild it. So if we can reduce soil disturbance, put cover crops out there, over time, we're going to gradually start to rebuild that organic matter. We know it doesn't happen immediately. You could go out and sample a year after using cover crops and see no change in organic matter. It takes a while for that change to build up to enough that we can see it with soil sampling. We know that soil organic matter is vital in a lot of different ways. And I sometimes use the very generalized analogy. If we're talking about soils that have low pore space and high bulk density, that's more brick-like, versus a more sponge-like soil that has low bulk density, high pore space, through having more organic matter, that's sponge-like. And we know when we get extra organic matter, not only do we get the increased water holding capacity, but we have a better ability through that residual organic matter to feed certain soil organisms. We have a better supply of crop nutrients and improved crop rooting. But just keep in mind, many of our soils, we've lost half of that sponge-like characteristic, half of that organic matter. Okay, a fourth area is the impact of cover crops and soil nutrients. And this can be sizable. We've traditionally thought of legumes as being important because of their nitrogen fixation, but we know that really any cover crop can impact soil nutrients. And part of it is getting past, when I was in graduate school 30 plus years ago, we were talking more about the nitrogen input output model. You put on a bushel, or you put on a pound of nitrogen fertilizer and you get a bushel of corn. Very simplified, but that was kind of the thinking. But now I think we realize that it's a much more complex situation. There's all these different microbes that are influencing nitrogen in the soil, the type of plants and cropping system we have, the application of manure, all those things are creating nitrogen cycling. And the thing I would say is the more health we have in the soil through the way that we manage it, the more that nitrogen will cycle where we want it to cycle, which is between the plants that we're growing and the root zone. And if we do not have good soil health, we tend to have a leakier soil system. So we can see leaching happening in the lower right part of this image where nitrogen might be lost out of the soil root zone. You can get denitrifying bacteria causing nitrogen to go off into the atmosphere. So we're going to lose some of it for sure, no matter what we do. But if we have a healthier soil, in part by using cover crops, we're going to get more of that nitrogen to cycle where we need it to be. Now, another role, as you are aware, is that cover crops can help scavenge nutrients. And we can do this with a variety of cover crops. Radishes are well known for their ability to take up a lot of nutrients in the fall. Last year in Missouri, we had a very dry summer, so there was a lot of nitrogen left over in cornfields at the end of the year. Great year for using cover crops to help scavenge or take up some of that leftover nitrogen or other nutrients and hold them in a form that would keep them from being lost from the root zone. Now, the challenge is which cover crops are best to take up the nutrients and then release them back at the time we need them for the cash crop. I think we're still learning about that. We know, for example, with radishes, if we just use radishes, they're probably releasing those nutrients earlier in the spring than is desirable, before the emerging corn or soybean crop can fully take advantage of it. So that's probably a situation where combining the radishes with an overwintering cereal can help even out the release of that nutrient. Okay, moving on to a fifth point, which is keeping the soil covered. Certainly you hear a lot about the role of cover crops. Obviously, it's just part of the name, but what we're learning is there's so many benefits from that residue layer. We think of holding the moisture in the soil more effectively. We know that that's going to happen because of reduced transpiration from the soil, or evaporation, I'm sorry, from the soil. We also are keeping the soil cooler, which is important for functionality of that microbial community and putting less stress on those crop roots. And I saw this banner on a farm that I was visiting for a cover crop field day several years ago, that the soil is meant to be covered. And I just stood there and looked at that. This was maybe in about 2015, and it just really hit me. I'd never really thought in those terms. But if you think about it, if you think about a prairie or a forest, those soils were covered with living roots and plants year-round, right? It would be very rare that there would be any bare soil. Maybe if you had a flood along a river or something. Or maybe if there were a lot of buffalo in a very small area, they might have disturbed some soil. But overall, that microbial community that we're saying is important to soil health and to our crop production evolved in a system with living roots year-round. So in our cropping systems of today, where we have so many months of the year where they tend to have bare soils or at least soils with no living roots, we're asking those microbes to evolve or survive in a system that they did not evolve for. So related to that, we also know that if we can add biodiversity to the plant community, that's going to be good for soil health. We can do that by having a mixture of cover crops, or even just if we get that cover crop in sequence with our cash crops. If we're just doing corn and soybeans, that's not a lot of biodiversity. Adding cereal rye alone helps, but better yet, if we can have a variety of cover crops over time in a field, especially as mixes, that's going to be a big plus for soil microbial communities. And just an example of some of the cover crops that can work well together: cereal rye, hairy vetch, crimson clover, be one of many different combinations farmers can use. And by the way, we do find that farmers tend to use more mixes of cover crops the longer they are cover cropping. That comes out clearly in our national cover crop survey in the years that we've been doing that. Another thing we're recognizing is the role of the cover crops in impacting the mycorrhizal fungi. I'm sure, been reading about these. They're really amazing organisms in terms of what they do for plants in exchanging nutrients and sometimes water to the plant roots for the carbohydrates or sugars being released by those crop roots. But if you think about the importance of something like corn roots being to explore as much of that soil volume as possible to get nutrients and water, the mycorrhizal fungi are helping, because they're helping that root get to more nutrients and potentially water in that soil volume, the root zone. And that's one reason we see cover crop fields doing well in a dry year compared to fields that haven't been cover cropped, is those fungi are helping the crop root get to more of the nutrients in the soil. Well, speaking of rain, I mentioned earlier the role of cover crops in helping with infiltration, but that rain is just so pivotal to the system. Most of you probably seen a rainfall simulator like is pictured here, where there's running a sprinkler over trays of soil that have been carefully sliced out. And I don't know about you, but the first time I saw one of these, I was really impacted by it because even though we'd had cover crops on the farm I grew up on, I'd also used tillage a lot on our own farm and in my agronomy research over the years. And I just thought that, hey, if you till the soil, it's looser, that's going to soak in more water, right? Well, anybody that's seen one of these rainfall simulators knows, it's pretty apparent that those loose tilled soils do not do a good job usually at soaking up the rain. Can depend to some extent on texture class, of course, but you can see in this picture the tilled soil that the water is running off into the front jar, and the cover crop soil next to it in the middle with the green foliage, the very little water is running off, it's infiltrating. And that's perhaps even more dramatically illustrated if you've seen those soils flipped over out of the pan. The one in the lower part of the picture here is the tilled soil. And again, this just kind of blew me away. This first time I saw it was how little infiltration was happening, because when we get these rainfall events, if we've got any significant amount of clay and silt in that soil, it starts to silt shut or prevent the rain from infiltrating. Those macropores I was talking about earlier are allowing that cover crop soil with less disturbance to get that water to infiltrate. So you see that upper pan of soil, the water has gone through relatively quickly, which is what we want. We want to get that rainfall into the soil. Now, compaction can also be a problem in affecting water infiltration. So what do cover crops have to offer here? We've all seen ruts in the field after fall harvest, especially if it's been wet conditions. We know it can be a challenge in the spring with larger and larger equipment. Compaction is increasingly becoming a yield limiting factor in a lot of fields. Now, cover crops aren't going to solve everything. They can't help prevent this necessarily, but they can be a pretty good preventative measure to keep good aggregate structure and avoid that happening. We're knowing that the mycorrhizal fungi help provide glues or glomalin in the soil that help bind those soil particles together to create the aggregate structure we're looking for. And that over time, that improved aggregate structure provides much less chance of compaction. So again, the microbial community is important to this, particularly the fungi. Our solution in the past was, of course, to get a big high horsepower tractor and a subsoiler and go out there and rip the soil. I had a friend who farms, and I was on a little trip with him a few years back, and he said, well, I want to stop and see this tractor. I need a higher horsepower tractor. And I said, well, why do you need a bigger tractor? And he says, well, I've got to run a subsoiler on my field from all the compaction. And so I started talking with him a little bit about some research from Ohio State that has shown over a several year period that cover crops are actually a more cost-effective approach than using equipment like this to reducing or recovering from compaction. And part of the factor is that the cover crops provide more lasting benefit for compaction. Now, the subsoiling can certainly be a short-term effective solution, but as the subsoils swell back together with clay, it doesn't necessarily provide lasting benefit. And the cover crops, through the roots and the macropores from earthworm activity, they're tending to help reduce that compaction over the long term more effectively. Okay, so moving to the last couple of areas, we're hearing a lot more about the importance of integrating livestock with row crops where feasible. Cover crops are certainly a way to make that happen. They allow a way for us to bring livestock into the landscape in a way that can be economically profitable. In fact, our SARE economic study on cover crops nationally showed that it's about $49 an acre would be an estimate if you're replacing hay for feeding cattle and using cover crops for grazing, that you can make that much extra profit. And those dollar amounts can vary pretty widely depending on what we're grazing and how long we're grazing. But the bottom line is it's a pretty profitable approach. And as I mentioned earlier, our soils evolved with these herbivores. So we're seeing this interesting pattern where the manure, urine, and saliva from grazing animals, such as beef cattle or sheep, are stimulating the soil biology. And it seems that one of the fastest ways we can improve soil health is by having grazing animals integrated with the cover crops in the system. I know that it's not feasible for everybody, but for those that have the opportunity to do that, can be a very effective approach. And of course, the cover crops, like I said, economically can be a high value forage, certainly higher quality than our late season pastures or early spring pastures. And if they're managed with management intensive grazing, can be quite effective. So the last area is cover crop impacts on soil erosion. At first glance, you may say, well, how does that relate to soil health? Erosion's something we want to avoid. Certainly something we know with more intense rainstorms is happening more frequently. Even where we have terraces and maybe minimum tillage, we can still see a lot of erosion is happening in this picture. The cover crops, where we can put them out in the landscape, make a dramatic difference. Depending on the study you look at, upwards of 90 to 95% reduction in erosion during the time those cover crops are growing. And even after they've stopped being grown, after they're terminated, they have lasting benefits for erosion, partly because that soil is having better infiltration. If we look at the overall impacts of erosion, we think of detachment, transport, and deposition. Well, those living and dead cover crop leaves and stems can help intercept the raindrops, so reduce that physical force causing detachment. The cover crop root channels and earthworm tunnels are helping get the rain to go into the soil, so there's less transport happening of the soil, because not as much water is moving across the surface, and the roots are helping anchor the soil and residue in place. And just to depict that, this was a photo extension agent took of a couple fields in Michigan, one that has just a minimal amount of cover crop growth. You know, the cover crop's less than an inch tall, not particularly thick here, but these two fields side by side, the one is blowing quite a bit and the other not at all. So it doesn't take much in the way of a cover crop to really help with wind or water erosion. The reason that this erosion connection exists to soil health has to do with where the biological activity is most intense, which is that top inch or so of the soil. That is by far the area of highest biological activity. And so that preserving and protecting that upper layer of soil, keeping it from washing away, is absolutely pivotal to maintaining and building soil health over time. I once saw a study that was looking at, well, what is the economic impact of erosion? And they were kind of hypothetically looking at an Iowa soil that might have 16 inches of topsoil. And they're saying, well, if you only lose the top inch, you still got 15 inches of topsoil, so maybe it's not that big of an economic loss. But I would submit that in a less disturbed soil, like where we're using cover crops and reduced tillage or no tillage, that top inch of soil is incredibly valuable. And so we really want to hold that in place as much as possible. And we also have, that's where we're going to have more nutrients and organic matter typically in our soils. So you put it all together, you may have seen this image we created for SARE. The cover crops are kind of unique as an agronomic tool in that there are so many potential positive benefits. It can vary depending on the cover crop and the use case that we have. But if you think of applying like a soybean fungicide, it's important. We're getting a particular benefit, but we don't get this whole suite of benefits that we can get for soil health from cover crop. So bottom line, they're a terrific tool that can provide a lot of different benefits. And I hope you found this top 10 impacts helpful, because the bottom line, of course, is building soil health, and cover crops are certainly a great way to get there. So thanks. Glad to have had this chance to visit with you. And again, happy to have you use any of these slides or the whole slide sets for your own educational programming. Back to you, Christina.
Thank you, Rob. There are a few questions in the chat box. I can go ahead and read them out. And as we go along, if you have more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. So first question is from Mary, and her question is, how does the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers impact earthworm activity?
I don't know the answer to that. If we had something like anhydrous ammonia, there would be a potential short-term negative impact. We know that on many soil microbes, it can have the anhydrous can have a temporary negative impact. There have been a little bit of studies showing that maybe it's not a huge long-term impact, but I would suspect Anhydrous could also be negative to earthworms in the short term. Other forms of nitrogen fertilizer as a salt might have a negative impact if it was concentrated enough, but I quite honestly don't know the overall impact. Maybe if somebody else does, they can comment in the chat.
All right. Adam has a question along the same lines about herbicides. How does prolonged herbicide use impact the microbiology of the soil food web, especially AMF?
Well, herbicides specifically, because there's so many different chemistries involved, I think there's a lot we have yet to learn about all those classes of chemicals. The one that has been the most studied in terms of soil microbial community is Roundup or glyphosate, and obviously very widely used. Bob Kramer, an ARS soil microbiologist here in Columbia, Missouri, where I'm at, has done quite a bit of research on the impacts of glyphosate on soil microbial communities. And he feels that there is a negative impact, both short-term and long-term, on at least some classes of soil organisms from use of glyphosate. Now, whether it's enough to dramatically change soil health or more incidental, I think that would depend on other factors, such as are cover crops being used that are kind of helping support that microbial community. If you were just doing, a no-till field and applying a lot of Roundup regularly, yeah, you might see it playing a negative role in that soil health over time. So Dr. Bob Kramer or Robert Kramer, if you looked up his research on glyphosate and soil microbes, would be some of the more extended work that's been done on it, but I know a few others have worked on that as well.
Thank you. Lucas is asking, given the extra money needed to implement cover crops, there is a need to demonstrate that cover crops will improve a farmer's bottom line. Do you have any resources that clearly demonstrate higher income following cover crops? For example, a partial budget analysis or output models?
Yeah, we did a national report through the USDA-SARE program on cover crop economics and released that in 2019. So I worked with a team on that. We had it extensively reviewed by economists and agronomists. And we used data primarily from our national cover crop survey because we had a lot of farmer information from all over the US, including yield data from about 500 farms. And we kind of did two things in that report, which is available online. Just do a search for SARE Cover Crop Economics Report, SARE, and you'll easily find that report. And we found that on average, it was taking about 3 years. Yep, thanks for putting that in the chat. It was taking about 3 years for cover crops to pay off on average, based on a slow but gradual increase in crop yields. And this was focusing mainly on corn and soybeans. And then a gradual reduction in input costs. Now, when we survey farmers, about half of them will reduce their nitrogen and other fertilizer use over time when using cover crops, and about half just stay consistent with what they've been doing before. With herbicides, a fair number are over time reducing their herbicide use. They may use one application of a post-emergent spray instead of two, or they may use a less expensive residual because the cover crops are helping with the weed control. What we also did in that report is we looked at several different scenarios where the cover crops come into play, such as if you had herbicide-resistant weeds, which of course the majority of farmers do in the Midwest now, would that help? Or if you were grazing cover crops or had soil compaction, so where the cover crops were used for a more targeted purpose. And what we found in that case is that in many of those situations, the cover crops could pay off in a year or two instead of 3 years. So I would encourage you to take a look at that report. There's certainly other information out there as well, but Soil Health Institute has a wonderful set of case studies from 100 different farms using no-till and cover crops and what the economic impact were. They found, I think, about 85% of the farmers using cover crops and no-till had improved net profit, and that the average net profit boost was in the range of about $50 an acre on corn and soybeans. I'm averaging, but it's in that ballpark in their case study analysis from several states. So a couple things to look at.
All right, thank you. Cody is asking, do you see a better adoption rate of cover crops from operators that own their cropland versus those that just rent? i.e., are operators that rent, especially with short-term year-to-year contracts, more likely to view cover crops as a cost rather than an investment compared to those that own the land?
Yeah, several years ago, I think a lot of us thought that it was probably more likely that people were using cover crops in their own land and less likely to use them on rented land. And so we've asked about that in our national cover crop survey, and Dr. Linda Prokopi at Purdue University, a social scientist, has also done quite a bit of research, especially in Indiana, but some more broadly in the Midwest, on that very question. Do farmers use cover crops or other conservation practices like no-till more on owned land versus rented land? If you look at the whole set of studies on this, you can find cases where there's a slight preference for using things like cover crops on owned land, but as a whole, it is less of a factor than I think many of us thought it was several years ago. And also related to that, there was a question, do landowners become a barrier to using cover crops? I'll just give a quick example. My dad had used cover crops when he was young. After he retired from farming, we had a tenant. We didn't have cover crops, and I got my dad to go to a meeting with our tenant on cover crops, and they decided together to start using them again. When my dad passed, my mom was like, yeah, I don't know if I want cover crops out there. They look kind of trashy. And I'm thinking, Mom, we've been talking about cover crops for years. So fortunately, there was a women landowner meeting that she went to not long after that and got convinced that cover crops were okay. But so it's just an example, the landowner can be, a reason that the farmer hesitates, the tenant, but it's also not as big of a factor as we used to think it was. And maybe because landowners are getting more familiar, but good question.
All right, Adam is just thanking you to bring up Robert's work because he has used it in the fall, or has used it, and he's having him come up to Leelanau this fall. And Adam, I'd love an invite when you bring him up. Leelanau's not far from me.
Thanks, Adam.
If you're interested in the SARE publication that Rob talked about, Lace put that in the chat box, so go ahead and check that out. And then we have a question from Shia. Will there ever be a scenario where farmers could be paid to plant and grow cover crops because of the ecosystem services that they provide?
Well, we're seeing that right now. There is more money flowing into cover crop incentives than at any time in the past. We've seen the amount of funds through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, going up almost every year on cover crops, particularly through their two main incentive programs, which are the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, and the Conservation Stewardship Program, or CSP. Those two programs, by the way, are getting big boost in money over the next 5 years from the Inflation Reduction Act. So there'll be almost double the amount of EQIP money 4 or 5 years from now as there is this year. And I would expect quite a bit of that will go to cover crops. But we're also seeing other sources of investment. For example, USDA spent $3 billion this year on a number of different a number of different climate smart grants, many of which have cover crops as either the sole or primary focus. For example, one is Farmers for Soil Health, that in a 20-state area, including all the Midwest, is providing payments to farmers to do cover crops starting this coming fall. So there's that $3 billion, a portion of which we don't know the exact amount, but I'm going to guess it's in the ballpark of $1 billion, maybe, or close to that are going towards cover crops. And now we're also seeing a lot of private sector investment because these companies are saying, we want to support regenerative agriculture for the ecosystem service benefits. Or maybe more specifically, we have goals to become carbon neutral as a company. And a key way we think we can get there is to encourage cover crops. And so for that reason, we're seeing almost every major food and ag company involved in some type of incentive to farmers for cover crops. Sometimes it's in a specific geographic area, like a 2-state area. PepsiCo, the parent company, just a couple of weeks ago announced They are spending $216 million in Illinois and Iowa, $216 million from one private company for regenerative ag practices. And as I understand it, a big focus of that will be cover crops along with no-till. So yeah, there's a lot of money flowing into this space for the ecosystem service benefits of cover crops.
All right, thank you. And I think with that, I am going to go ahead and share my screen real quick. All right, thank you for coming today. We're going to go ahead and jump into our breakout session. And in this breakout session, if you want to discuss the impressions of your topic, this is a really good time to talk about what you've heard, any current thing going on in your state, and then you can discuss upcoming future topics. We always love to hear from you what speakers you want and what topics you want us to talk about. So if you want to discuss that, and with that, go ahead and pick your room. Just click on the room you want to go to and have a good discussion. Once you're done talking, you're free to go. Please fill out the survey at the end, but thank you for coming today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rob, and thanks everyone. At the bottom of the Zoom should be a breakout rooms button that you can click and then select to join either the educator, researcher, agency, student, or farmer group. And a quick note that next month we'll be talking on May 17th, and we'll have Jenny Seifert from the University of Wisconsin-Madison joining us about talking about one good idea, the not quite YouTube for farmers throughout the North Central region.